Long before demons had stormed Earth, before the Doomslayer would arise to smack down literally himself in demonic form, and before the discovery of Argent energy, a species existed in a different part of the universe that was quite literally built different. Also, it may have been another universe entirely, to be honest with you. But hailing from an incredibly dangerous planet pierced by an asteroid from pole to pole, this race of humanoids that looked suspiciously like humans would arise from this collision with the spacefaring object. Having been released, or so their texts say, they could move out into the dangerous and chaotic landscape where titanous beasts roam and sundered the land. Over time, though, through their own ingenuity and iron wills, they would step up to the plate to take down the beasts amongst other dangerous wildlife around them that far outclassed their own natural abilities. Ultimately, this would result in them becoming the dominant species on Argenta, which would go on to attract the attention of other species around them. So in today's episode, we'll be discussing the lore and actual physiology of the Night Sentinels to get a good understanding of just how powerful the Marauders from Doom Eternal are. So I believe the first place we should start out is, who are the Night Sentinels and what exactly did they have to contend with over time? Much like our own species, they emerged on a planet where at the beginning they were far from the apex species and instead were likely taken out in droves. But through big brain hours and their own will to survive and thrive, they would go on to conquer Argenta until some creepy aliens got a little too greedy and basically shreked the entire setup, which resulted in the end of this mighty race. Or at least the end of most of this mighty race. So it all started with a giant asteroid drifting through space, and this is where all the problems begin. Like quite literally, had this not happened, countless species would have not fallen and been corrupted. If you need a reason to dislike the Maykrs, well, here you go. This asteroid that drifted through space would strike the barren planet of Argenta with such force that it completely pierced it through and then came out the other side. Now, typically this would be enough to blow apart a planet, but what it appears to have done is possibly remake it. Melting the surface of the world, which can be deduced considering the energy unleashed, this would shift the planet into a more life-bearing place. Creatures known as elemental wraiths would begin to be released into this world from the opening, and over time, the planet would become much more hospitable to life. Violent creatures would be made, and the planet would be remade into something that would go on to be completely screwing with other several species on different planets. Eventually, one species in particular would arise as the Argenta, and basically from here, it became nothing but a solid fight. This lowly species would discover the power of the sword and eventually drive back the beasts and the others on the planet who didn't share their same sentiments as themselves. It seemed as though at this time that everything in their mother was trying to take out this specific set of Argenta. Earthquakes, storms, barbarians, titans, and beasts continued their attack on the Night Sentinels, but over time, they conquered all. This gained the attention of the huge nerds known as the Makyrs, which would go on to completely bone the universe. As the Night Sentinels continued to fight and win on their home turf, creatures known as the Maykrs would approach them. This species was far more advanced than the Night Sentinels, and with this knowledge, they would bestow on the Argenta powerful artifacts for them to use in battle. They would also essentially teach them how to space travel and give them ships in order for the Night Sentinels to help the Maykrs in their conquests. At the beginning, it was actually a pretty good setup because the Maykrs promised the Night Sentinels an afterlife, which, as you might imagine, the Night Sentinels were pretty jazzed about. The combination of these two societies meant that they could spread out amongst the cosmos and convert other species to their way of thinking, which in turn allowed for their armies to grow to massive proportions. That said, however, only the Argenta could actively be called a Night Sentinel and join those ranks. This caused the Night Sentinels to view the Maykrs as gods, which freed them from their fear of a dirt nap. For a time, everything was turning up Millhouse for this covenant. With worlds being conquered left, right, and center, it seemed like nothing could really challenge the might of this pairing, and as they continued to work together, it seemed like there was no ending in sight for this pact. However, across the universe, humanity, being the giant nerds that we are, would totally screw up our own prospects. You see, messing around with portal technology sometimes is not good. A soldier known as Doomguy would be thrust into combat with the demonic creatures, as not only Mars was screwed by this interaction, but Earth would be invaded as well. He would choose to go to hell to rip and tear for all times. Doomguy, being stronger than your average human, like way stronger, was a force to be reckoned with, deriving his strength and resilience from his gamer rage. This allowed him to exist for some time in hell until he would eventually leave hell and be teleported to Argenta for reasons unknown. Prior to this happening, the Maykrs foresaw a Dark One rising, which scared them. It would threaten the covenant that the Maykrs and the Night Sentinels had formed, and from their perspective, they really had no idea why. The schism was so concerning that a divinity machine was created to purify the species to continue their safety as a working, cohesive unit. For a time, nobody was found. For so many generations, and actually so much time had passed, that everyone except a privileged few, basically just the Mother God, completely forgot about it. After picking up Doomguy, he was then judged with the others in the Colosseum, which seems a bit messed up as he really hadn't committed any crimes, but was given the glory to serve on the front lines. However, there were a couple things that were stranger about him. A, they had no idea where he came from. 2, he was like incredibly strong. And D, he spoke in a kind of ugly tongue, as they say, and his armor was completely foreign. But moving back to the way he's actually speaking, I've heard the Sentinel dialect and I counter with no you. But over time, the Doomguy would return again and again after each battle and proved himself to be the strongest amongst them. He still would receive no reward or rank for his deeds, but instead would start to be viewed as a tool to be used against the enemies. However, when he did speak, he spoke of others and demons and huge guts that needed to be torn. This piqued the interest of the Maykrs as they requested his wounds be dressed and him brought to them. Assuming it to be another conquerable species, they would get enough information and learn about hell and the demons before eventually opening their own portals to their hellscape. Seeing as the place was absolutely terrible, the Maykrs and Sentinels viewed it as another opportunity to expand the mentality that they possessed to this horrible place. But ultimately, it would be the end of all they worked to build. After opening these portals and fighting, a new portal would open on Argenta as the link had been solidified. These portals would unleash the demons on the planet as well as titans to rival the titans that were already located on Argenta. Now, they say they don't know where it came from, but it was probably the Maykrs. Anyways, the Night Sentinels rose to meet this new threat, but suffered defeat after defeat as everyone that dropped, more would arise. Eventually, it became understood that they needed to learn about these creatures, and in doing so, this opened the door for their own destruction. While the battles raged on, the Doomguy would continue to rip and tear, as one does, and the Night Sentinels would begin to see him more as a valued warrior than just a frontline fodder. With the battle continuing on, ultimately this would result in Doomguy being put in the divinity machine and endowed with the strength, basically making him a demigod known as the Doomslayer. This took place unbeknownst to the Maykrs, which would seal their fate as being unalive. Anyhow, through time, the priests learned of the demons and learned that the source of their power was actually hell energy. This hell energy offered the Maykrs a way to bypass the transfiguration process that all Maykrs feared and promised the Night Sentinels the ability to basically be immortal. Now, much like a scam, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. With time, the hell energy became adapted for use. Technology began exploding upwards in scale, and the combined might of those two species became astronomical, and everything seemed to be going quite well. But much like a silent cancer that continues to grow, this would be their undoing. As the Night Sentinels were sent in mission after mission into the hellscape, eventually they would stumble across something that highly alarmed them: factories. These factories supported untold suffering and soul extraction in order to refine the hell energy that was then directly exported to Urdak to power the Maykrs. The Night Sentinels would return after missions to find that their own species was becoming more and more corrupted by its use, but not wanting to turn against their gods, they would keep it to themselves. Those that did protest would be ostracized or silenced, so probably not a good time. Eventually, however, it became apparent that the Maykrs ordered the building of these factories, and that the Night Sentinels, in conquering other species, were literally just feeding the factories these innocents. This did not sit right with the Night Sentinels, as their whole purpose was to bring a righteous doctrine to those that they conquered. In the end, they would have to turn against the Maykrs. They would return home and begin discussing what to do, which would result in a schism that was feared long ago. The schism resulted in a civil war between the peoples, as those who really didn't care about the factories and remained with the Maykrs because they had grown accustomed to the energy usage and likely were actually corrupted themselves, and then those that realized that this was pretty messed up. Their doctrine was being tampered with, and they were essentially acting as firewood gatherers, except with lives and souls. They sided with the priests, who were believed to be on the side of righteousness, but they pulled a non-pro gamer move and then turned against the Night Sentinels, so the priests, not that great. Under the guise of finally ending the civil war between the Argenta people, the main factory known as the Necroval was discovered and was to be attacked. This would cut off energy to Urdak and thus break this addiction to hell energy. The Night Sentinels were assured everything was good to go, but spoiler, things were not good to go. Instead, after entering the portals, they found the way back blocked by the priests. The betrayer had turned against the Night Sentinels to save his son, and in doing so, sealed the fates of the Sentinel soldiers with the help of the priests. This, as you might imagine, was a pretty bad time. Soldiers were torn apart on the other side of this portal. Most, if not all, would actually fall after taking out countless demons, but the Doomslayer would be one who would go on to survive to continue his campaign against the demons and ultimately the Maykrs, ending everything once and for all by taking down the demonic version of himself. But shortly after the schism, things went sideways for all those that fought for the Maykrs. The Night Sentinels, currently engaged in their bidding, should they fall, would not receive the afterlife that they craved. Because of the use of hell energy, they would be raised back up and denied this finality, which is basically like Vader altering the deal, pray he does not alter it further. But the Night Sentinels still chose not to turn against their gods. These turned Sentinels maintained all the prowess and training that they had in their former life, but now had the added strength given to them by the Argent energy. This would go on to alter them in ways which we have seen in other species changed, which is discussed in several of my Doom videos, but unlike humanity, for instance, their alterations seem to be much more reserved. Speaking of their alteration, let's talk about these changes and then possibly why they may have been changed to the way they are. So first thing we must discuss is the overall build of the Marauder versus the Doomslayer. Initially, the Doom Marine or Doomguy is roughly about 6'2" and about 230 pounds because of the muscular build that the Marine has. This comes out to 1.87 meters and roughly 104.3 kilograms, so the average size of a human. In the Colosseum, him, we see the Doomslayer is fighting people roughly his height, which means that humans and Argenta are about the same height and build as Doomguy. However, this seems to be more average of a build for the Argenta species, whereas this would be on the upper side of limitations for Homo sapiens. This could imply that the Night Sentinel planet may put more stressors on the body, such as higher gravitational pull, requiring for more muscle mass and stronger bones to contend with this. Another factor may be that because of the hostile nature of the planet, this has weeded out the smaller and weaker of their species in a form of intense selective pressure, which resulted in only the strongest Night Sentinels remaining and then repopulating. What it looks like is your average Night Sentinel or Argenta is between 6 feet to 6'5" and between 200 to 250 pounds, which comes out to 1.82 to 1.98 meters tall and 90 to about 113 kilograms. But then again, also, we see that after the Doomslayer becomes the Doomslayer, the Betrayer is roughly the same size. So they're actually just really large people. But again, take this with a grain of salt, considering that these are soldiers and they're quite literally bred for combat. You know, something like Gears of War logic. Considering the mutagenic nature of Argent energy, which when it turns humans, soldiers appear to be much larger and muscular than they were originally. And this can also result in things like the Revenants, who completely tower over the Slayers and Sentinels at a height of 8'6" or 2.5 meters. It's clear that Argent energy completely changes the fabric of a species to be larger than what it originally was. Now, all this is to say, this is just the standard unaltered form of Doomguy and the Sentinels. Upon his entry into the divinity machine, Doomguy would become the Slayer and would forever be changed physically for it. Growing 6 more inches and gaining over 120 pounds, he would stand at 6'8" and 360 pounds, which works out to 2.1 meters and 163.3 kilograms. So, a completely beefy dude to house the power of being a demigod. But compared to a Marauder, the Doomslayer actually isn't really that tall, and some would even say a bit of a manlet. Not me, because I wish I was 6'8", but standing in front of one another, the Doomslayer would approach the clavicle of the Marauder, meaning that the Marauder is likely about 1.5 feet taller than him, which would put the Marauder actually at nearly 8 feet tall. I would say based on the measurements, he appears to be about 8 feet 2 inches, which is 2.46 meters tall. But due to this exposure, the height they gain for the mutations induced by this energy appears to fall in line with what we have seen, again, with like our own species being affected. However, unlike our species, the mass of the Marauder appears to have doubled as well, meaning that he's actually growing at a standard rate. It's not just one part like the bones of him growing or just like the muscle growing like we've seen in Pinky. But without the armor and the Doomslayer himself being about 360 pounds, I could easily see the Marauder breaching the 500-pound mark and possibly above it. With the armor on him, this could add upwards another 80 to 100 pounds of weight, making the Marauder's actual weight somewhere in line between 600 to 700 pounds, or 272.1 to 317.5 kilograms. For reference, that's about the weight and size of a fully grown male grizzly bear, but probably more voracious. And if you really wanted to be a nerd, you could also say that the horn growth could be the actual point of measurement in which you go down to the toes, which would easily put this guy at around like 9 feet to 9 feet 5 inches, but let's be real, top of the head is a better measurement. Anyhow, moving away from the body metrics for a moment, starting with the feet, we can see that not much has changed, but we can definitely tell his feet are larger than our naturally occurring form. But because of what we just talked about, this is incredibly standard to see with those who have been raised by hell energy. They wear a thick piece of armor in this area, covering the feet as well as the shins and calves, because if human biology can be applied here, then this area would be critical to protect, as the Achilles tendon resides in this area. Moving past the knee, we see that the legs are quite large and elongated from the bone growth. This has caused the muscle tissue to elongate as well, but from what we can see in a moment, muscle growth is really no issue. But what's also interesting is the muscle growth was maintained in their bodies in, say, the structural way as their original form. In a lot of demons, it would appear that their physical structuring is altered, but this may be a timing thing. Whereas the Marauders were only recently changed into what they are, other demons may have existed for a much longer time and thus been altered more heavily. And it's totally possible that this is still an ongoing process, and as things continue, this could result in more mutated forms later. Moving back up to the pelvic and abdominal region, we see armor flanks either side of the legs, protecting them from damage, but considering they are tasked with hunting the Doomslayer, they would need it. But interestingly, the armor actually ends at around the abdominal area, and we see here that the muscle has been altered to be larger, but why you wouldn't want to protect the actual organs of somebody is very strange. Anyhow, as we see with the Betrayer or the other Night Sentinels, they're all fairly muscular. However, considering the Marauder's height growth and weight gain, it's clear that even with the muscle the guy possessed initially, it would stretch to the capacity much like we see with the other demons. Muscle must have been added to allow this much to exist in this form. Moving further up the chest, we see minimal armoring continues onto the shoulders, but where the presumed heart would be of the Marauder exists an Argent accumulator. Much like on the Cyber Demon, which also wears similar armor as the Marauders, this replaces the heart and gives a form of life to the body after their expiration. Destroying this would likely cause the Marauder to meet its end, but destroying the body also completely does the trick as well. Moving down the arms, we see on the left arm the armor goes all the way down. This is for the Marauder's super force multiplier, and seeing as the arm does not need to be as mobile, this is perfect to provide protection but still offer mobility. On the right arm, which means the Night Sentinels also have hand preferences, where all my righties at, the armor is less restrictive to allow for the Marauder to swing the axe that it possesses at the Doomslayer, but also get the axe taken away from it to be used against itself. We also see the hands are much longer, and like the other demons, they possess claws, showing that its body has been heavily infested with the Argent energy. Moving up to the head, we can also see that the skin has been sunken in, and much like the rest of the body, the skin looks ashen and white, indicating that the person definitely met their end before being raised back up. The eyes are sunken in and have turned red, and this is because of the Argent energy. We also see that the nose has completely fallen off the face, showing a lot of the same skull structures as a human. 4 pairs of horns have now formed, 2 raised up to give it more height, with 2 flanking either side of the cheekbones, which would protect the head from damage as well. A central line of smaller horns run from the forehead to the back of the neck. What's interesting is, much like how the Cyber Demon remembers who you are before it begins to attack, the Marauders are also well aware of who you are. The first one you come across talks the most smack about you and how you were never one of them, which, is that like supposed to hurt the Doomslayer's feelings? Nah, man. This would indicate that to a degree the brain is still functional in its original capacity, something with lesser demons and altered humans that appears to be lacking. Possibly this could be due to a more wild variant of demonic energy changing versus a focused alteration by the way of Maykrs. But it's also possible that the reason humans don't recognize you and will attack anybody once they've been turned is because their soul is gone, whereas the soul of the actual Night Sentinel has been corrupted. This brain preservation would be a fantastic deal considering all the training that the Night Sentinels endured. This would be remembered and could be used against other Night Sentinels and the Doomslayer himself. But this also allows for the Marauder to make judgments and attack more effectively, dodging attacks and using his shield to protect himself. However, this Argent energy exposure also appears to alter the very energy that the Night Sentinels once had in the form of their astral canine companions. They're able to release a demonic hellhound to attack the Doomslayer, but we also see an unaltered version of this canine, with the Doomslayer having apparently been endowed with the same power early when he returns to Argent Nerve. But all this really doesn't matter when it comes down to the Doomslayer, as there's nothing quite like getting up close and personal when you see your old compatriot. Now, the standard form of taking on Marauder does apply. If you separate its semi-working brain from its body, then it will cease to be. But one interaction in particular is quite interesting. When you go to punch the Marauder, the strength that it appears to have almost rivals that of the Doomslayer. The Marauder is able to grab a punch from the Slayer, something that other demons do not appear to be able to survive, and then stop the punch. However, the blade in the Slayer's arm is able to pierce its face, taking it out quickly. But apart from that, you either turn the brain into sludge with a step, or completely trisect the Marauder with a crucible. And that's going to be what you get for abandoning your holy doctrine.